It was a sunny afternoon in the bustling city, and the parking lot was packed with people going about their day. Among them was a well-dressed woman in her early 30s, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement as she approached her shiny, spotless car. She was proud of her success, and her car was a symbol of the hard work that had gotten her there. But as she got closer, her confident stride faltered. There, leaning against her car, was a scruffy man with tattered clothes and a weathered face. His belongings, a small, worn backpack, were scattered nearby. Her frustration flared instantly. Without hesitation, she stormed up to him and demanded to know why he was sitting on her car. Her voice was sharp, her words cutting, as she accused him of disrespecting her property. The man, startled, quickly stood up and apologized in a soft, tired voice. But she wasn't interested in his excuses. She waved him off, watching as he gathered his things and walked away without another word. Feeling justified but still annoyed, she unlocked her car and slid into the driver's seat. That's when she noticed it, a small, folded piece of paper tucked under her windshield wiper. Her irritation grew. "What now?" she muttered, stepping back out to grab the note. She unfolded it, expecting an apology or perhaps some excuse. Instead, what she read stopped her cold. Her heart skipped a beat, and her hands began to tremble as she took in the words. What did the man leave behind? And why would it change everything she thought she knew about that moment? The note was written in shaky handwriting, the kind that made it clear the writer had taken care to make it legible despite unsteady hands. The words were simple, but they hit like a punch to the gut. I'm sorry for sitting on your car. I didn't mean any harm. I was just so tired and needed a place to rest. Thank you for letting me have a moment of peace. I hope you have a wonderful day. Her annoyance evaporated, replaced by a wave of guilt that crashed over her like cold water. She glanced around the parking lot, but the man was gone, blending into the sea of people or perhaps disappearing down a side street. She hadn't even thought to look at him closely, to see the exhaustion in his eyes or the weight he carried, not just in his belongings, but in his very posture. Sliding back into her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd missed something important. She replayed the interaction in her mind, this time noticing the details she'd overlooked in her anger, the way his hands trembled as he picked up his bag, the faint stubble on his face that hinted at days without a proper shave, and the way he avoided her gaze, as though he'd been scolded 100 times before, and knew exactly how this encounter would play out. As she drove away, her mind raced. She couldn't help but wonder about his story. Who was he? How had he ended up in such a difficult position? And why had he left such a kind note after being treated so poorly? The questions nagged at her, and by the time she reached home, she felt a strange mix of emotions, shame, curiosity, and an unshakable sense of responsibility. She thought about the life she'd built for herself, the comforts she enjoyed, and the times she'd taken them for granted. The next day, she couldn't resist driving back to the same parking lot, hoping she might see him again. She told herself it was just to apologize, but deep down, she knew it was more than that. She wanted to understand. Hours passed as she sat in her car, scanning the crowd. Just as she was about to give up, she spotted him. He was sitting on a bench this time, his backpack beside him, and a paper cup of coffee cradled in his hands. She hesitated, her heart pounding before finally stepping out of the car and walking toward him. When she approached, he looked up, his expression wary but polite. Hi, she began, her voice softer than it had been the day before. I think I owe you an apology. He blinked, surprised but said nothing. She took a deep breath and continued. I shouldn't have spoken to you the way I did yesterday. I was rude, and I didn't take the time to understand your situation. I'm sorry. For a moment, he just stared at her, as though trying to decide if her words were genuine. Finally, he gave a small nod. Thank you, he said quietly. Encouraged by his response, she sat down on the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. I found the note you left, she said, glancing at him. It was kind of you to write that. He shrugged, his shoulders lifting and falling as though the gesture carried the weight of the world. It wasn't much. Just the truth. She wanted to ask him so many questions, but she didn't want to pry. Instead, she started with something simple. "Do you come here often?" He nodded. "It's a good spot. Busy enough that people don't notice you, but not so crowded that it feels overwhelming." As they talked, bits and pieces of his story began to emerge. His name was Daniel, and he'd once had a life not so different from hers, a steady job, a small apartment, and dreams for the future. But a series of misfortunes had unraveled everything. First, he'd lost his job when the company downsized. Then came the medical bills after a car accident. Without a safety net, he'd fallen behind on rent and eventually found himself on the streets. "It's not something you think will happen to you," he said, his voice tinged with quiet resignation. "One day you're doing fine, and the next, everything's gone." She listened, her heart aching with every word. She thought about how easily her own life could have taken a similar turn if not for the support of her family and friends. She wanted to help, but she didn't know how. Offering money felt impersonal, and she worried it might come across as pity. Instead, she decided to start small. "Have you eaten today?" she asked. He hesitated, then shook his head. "Not yet." "Come on," she said, standing up. "Let me buy you lunch." He looked at her, surprised and a little wary, but eventually, he nodded and followed her to a nearby cafe. Over sandwiches and coffee, they talked more. She learned about his love for music, his favorite books, and the things he missed most about his old life. As they parted ways, she couldn't stop thinking about him. She wanted to do more, but she wasn't sure where to start. That night, she found herself researching local shelters and organizations that helped people experiencing homelessness. She even reached out to a friend who worked in social services, asking for advice. But as much as she wanted to help Daniel, she also realized she needed to confront something within herself, the part of her that had judged him so harshly at first glance. It wasn't just about making amends, it was about becoming a better person. The next time she saw Daniel, she had a plan. But little did she know, there was more to his story than she could have imagined. And as their lives continued to intersect in unexpected ways, she would come to realize that this chance encounter was just the beginning of something much bigger. What would she discover about Daniel's past? And how would their unlikely connection change both of their lives forever? As the days turned into weeks, their conversations became more frequent. Each time they met, Daniel shared a little more about his life, peeling back the layers of his story. The woman who once saw him as an inconvenience now saw him as a person with hopes, dreams, and struggles. She began to realize how much she had underestimated the depth of someone else's journey. One afternoon, she surprised him with a small gift, a notebook, and a set of pens. "You said you used to write," she explained. "Maybe this can help you start again." Daniel's eyes lit up as he accepted the gift. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't even remember the last time I had something new." She smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't expected. It wasn't about the gift itself, it was about seeing the spark of joy it brought him. That evening, Daniel sat on the same bench where they had first truly spoken, scribbling in the notebook. He wrote about his memories, his struggles, and his dreams for the future. It was the first time in years he felt a sense of purpose. Meanwhile, the woman couldn't shake the feeling that there was more she could do. She began volunteering at a local shelter, hoping to better understand the challenges people like Daniel faced. Through her work there, she met others with stories just as heartbreaking and inspiring as his. It opened her eyes to the systemic issues that kept people trapped in cycles of poverty and homelessness. One day, as she and Daniel shared a coffee, she asked him a question that had been on her mind for weeks. "If you could do anything right now, no limits, what would it be?" Daniel thought for a moment, then smiled faintly. "I'd open a little bookstore. Nothing fancy, just a place where people could come, sit, and lose themselves in a good story. Books were always my escape, you know? They made me feel like anything was possible." The simplicity of his dream moved her. It wasn't about wealth or status, it was about creating something meaningful. That night, she stayed up late, brainstorming ways to help Daniel. She knew she couldn't change his life overnight, But maybe, just maybe, she could help him take the first step. The next morning, she called her friend in social services. Together, they worked on getting Daniel the resources he needed: a place to stay, access to healthcare, and help finding a job. It wasn't easy, and there were setbacks along the way, but Daniel's determination never wavered. As he began to rebuild his life, he found himself reflecting on how much had changed since that day in the parking lot. He never expected a chance encounter to lead to so much kindness and opportunity. And yet, here he was, taking steps toward a future he'd once thought impossible. Months later, Daniel stood outside a small shop with a freshly painted sign above the door, Second Chance's Bookstore. The woman stood beside him, beaming with pride. "You did it," she said, handing him a pair of scissors to cut the ribbon. He shook his head, smiling. "We did it." The bookstore quickly became a community hub, a place where people from all walks of life could gather. Daniel made it a point to hire others who had faced similar struggles, giving them the same chance he'd been given. The woman often stopped by, sometimes to help out, other times just to sit and read. She loved seeing how the space had transformed not just physically, but in the way it brought people together. One day, as she browsed the shelves, she found a notebook tucked between two books. Curious, she opened it and realized it was Daniel's. Inside were pages filled with reflections, poems, and letters he'd written to himself. One entry caught her eye. "To the woman who saw me when I felt invisible, thank you for reminding me that kindness still exists. You didn't just help me, you believed in me." And that made all the difference. Tears welled in her eyes as she closed the notebook. She realized that while she had set out to help Daniel, he had given her something just as valuable: a new perspective on life and a deeper understanding of the power of compassion. The bookstore thrived, and so did Daniel. But more importantly, their story became a testament to the idea that small acts of kindness can ripple out in ways we can't predict. As she left the bookstore that day, she felt a sense of peace. Life had a funny way of bringing people together, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. And while she couldn't change the world, she knew she had made a difference, one person, one story, at a time. Their paths had crossed by chance, but the impact they had on each other's lives was anything but accidental. It was a reminder that sometimes, all it takes to change a life is to truly see someone, to listen, and to care. And as Daniel welcomed another customer into his bookstore, he couldn't help but smile. He knew that his story wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone who had ever felt lost, overlooked, or forgotten.